How did ancient cultures around the world all have the capability to construct these huge megalithic stones and carve them, quote unquote, or shape them in some fashion to where they're essentially interlocked perfectly in a myriad of geometric shapes? And we have entire walls, temples, structures, etc. built out of this kind of construction. I mean, what the hell is going on? How is it that historians, archaeologists they have access to the same stuff that we have access to, right? How is it that archaeologists and historians have this unbelievable ability to completely ignore comparative architecture and mythology amongst the cultures, right? We can compare two completely different cultures. We can compare two pictures of a temple, over there in Egypt and a temple over in South America. And we will find that the construction is literally identical depending on, where you're at and what age the thing was built in. We have identical construction, and it's not like it's not even to a point to where you're like, yeah, maybe it's kind of the same. No, it is identical. It's frustratingly insulting, actually, that mainstream historians and archaeologists don't see what's right in front of their face. Right? Even without, we don't even have to have a theory or anything. It's right in front of our face. You can compare two pictures and they're identical. That immediately, this fact, a scientific fact, one that you yourself can prove physically using basic observational skills. You can fly to one part of the world and go to the ruins, and then you can go to the other part of the world, and you will find what is essentially the identical construction style. But of course, mainstream historians and archaeologists, no, bro. Everybody's, you know what? In fact, I don't even think I have even found a single historian or archaeologist that went out of their way to somehow prove that this makes sense. Like, I have not found that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but now that I think about it, yeah, I'm actually surprised that I have not run into that. Because, I don't know, you would think somebody over there would eventually kind of have to tackle the situation. Just us sitting right here. You don't have to be an archaeologist to see how they're identical. Alright, I'll calm down. But you know what I'm talking about. Like, what is this? How is it that this obvious observational fact exists and it has had zero, and I mean nada, el zilcho impact on basically any of mainstream history, right? Nobody has like I said, they don't even acknowledge it, apparently. But here it is. We have to deal with this, right? We cannot as historians, chronologists, archaeologists, whatever your field is, all of them, always good. We as archaeologists, historians, chronologists, we cannot ignore this. And so we won't ignore it. We'll actually attack it and we'll see what we can come out with. So this is part two. Yeah, two. This is part two of this. We already did the first part, and the first part we went over a few possibilities on how these ancient cultures could have built these stones or carved these stones or whatever, basically how they made the stones. And a couple of examples of what we covered last time was we went over the possibility of a biological chemical that could be extracted from a plant. And then apparently that biochemical can actually soften stone. And there's some interesting proof for that. And there's historical proof too for it, interestingly enough. Now, by the way, I'm not saying any of these methods are real or I don't know, I guess. Yeah, let's keep it like that. I don't know. Like, I'm not party to any of these. I'm not selling a book, right? I'm just going over some of the more interesting ways or possible ways that the ancients could have pulled this off. Anyway, I'm just trying to find the various possibilities as to how they were able to pull all of this stuff off. Because it's insane. I mean, you look at this stuff and it's impressive, right? I mean, the interlocked ways that this particular kind of construction represents is wholly unique to this or to a specific time period. And that possibility is huge, right? Because if we can link somehow, cultures all around this planet existing simultaneously that were somehow, really on the same wavelength, I'll just say, I mean, that's impressive. And that would probably have to count for something. And of course, that would ultimately, that would demand mainstream history get changed. And there is absolutely no way that mainstream is ever going to be changed. And that's basically a fact. If you think about it, I mean, history has not really budged in the past, 80 years or so in the Western world. I mean, it has been unbelievably stagnant. Even though we are faced with all kinds of just insane evidence that shows how wrong it is. I mean, these people, they don't care, man. They very much are okay, I'm gonna go off on that forever. Okay. Alright, so let's move on to another potential way that these cultures could have constructed these blocks. And I'm only going to focus just on the block. I'm not going to go into the structural stuff or any of that. I just want to know, how the hell did they make a block? We'll keep it really simple. That's my critical thinking question. How the hell did they make this? That's our question. So how did they do it, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to look at the stuff that people have figured out before us. So we're just starting fresh, by the way. So we'll just start from scratch. In fact, just saying that, I mean, starting from scratch, that's actually a pretty healthy thing you can do. It's a very healthy approach to a problem you are trying to solve, especially if it's one that you've been working on for, decades or something, right? You get so attached to the problem, you get tunnel vision. And then once you get tunnel vision, then, it can become difficult for you to look around, basically. So we're going to look around. So in the first show, we covered a few ideas, but one of the things I do want to actually throw out there is that I am still technically open to a mainstream, quote unquote, explanation to how this stuff works. But of course, I can only accept a scientific explanation, to be blunt, right? If an Egyptologist is going to make some sort of a claim, how the stones were shaped or whatever, they better have the 100% scientific evidence to back that up. I mean, I want to see like a hardcore example of people doing this with copper chisels. For example, in Egypt, copper chisels and wood. Apparently that's all it takes, and you can carve granite and all this stuff. And there's just kind of a point where it's like, it sounds ridiculous, but hey, if you can prove it, like, you can show us, like, do it. I mean, not like, I want to see all these blocks put together, built up from scratch with those tools. If a mainstream archaeologist does that, I'm still open to that. But, I have not seen anything like that. And it does not look like we are going to find that happening anytime soon. The reason is because scientifically, there's a lot against that point of view on how those stones could have been shaped. For example, we have Egyptologists, telling us that all of this stuff was done with copper chisels. That does not jive with real world testable science. Like, we know this for a fact. We could do the experiment right now. I mean, we have this ability. The problem is that the mainstream is not providing anything convincing to go against that. So I get it. It's obvious that something is up, but I want to make the point that I'm still open really to anybody having the truth. So with that said, let's get into one of the next possible ways that these stones could have been created. And created is a good word, because the next situation I want to talk about, or the next possible explanation, is what's called geopolymers. Now, geopolymers are essentially, I mean, everybody knows cement. That's a geopolymer. That's it. So basically just imagine cement. Now, cement's a perfect example, actually, because we could think of cement, we could think of shaping cement, because cement is, you know, it's very viscous, but it's something we can is malleable, right? We can form it, we can shape it, you know, we can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. So if a geopolymer was involved in the creation of these stones, suddenly a lot of stuff changes. So basically the premise is this: did the Maya, did the ancient Egyptians, or I should say the Aztecs, or did anybody, or any culture I should say, around this planet that was building in this polygonal block style, did these people not carve, you know, and chisel out stone all day, but did they instead just make a type of concrete, poured it into a mold, and or shaped it using very basic concepts that we would understand today and maybe even use today? Is this a possibility? Did the ancients understand the concept of concrete, or a type of concrete? A geopolymer. You know what I mean. A geopolymer. Could they do this? Did our ancestors figure this out back in the day? Mainstream geologists and historians and archaeologists will immediately say, no, this is not possible. Which is an incredibly stupid opinion to have. I mean, mainstream literally believes that our ancestors during this particular period of time, and I mean the time to where historians are literally willing to admit that they are building these amazing structures, they will still say that our ancestors were essentially cave people stacking rocks. I mean, that's it. That is the perspective of the mainstream when it comes to this situation. How insane is that? Like, just how absolutely mind-numbingly stupid is that? I mean, all right, you get my point. Ugh, you know, and to make matters even worse with respect to this situation, so far as the mainstream is concerned, they honestly believe that these guys just sat there and chiseled out these stones. Like, it's that simple. There's no problem making these polygonal stones, shape them perfectly, have them interlocked literally perfectly. I mean, the mainstream archaeologist has no problem in saying that, yeah, they just carved them, bro. I mean, that's it. It's just an unbelievable perspective. I'm still open to it, but if we are intellectually and historically honest, we have to admit that our ancestors were not dumb, obviously not stupid. I mean, the work is right there. Idiots do not develop this kind of architecture. We do not find stupid people doing stuff like this, right? So we have to give credit where credit is due. So we will not be following the mainstream with respect to how they treat our general ancestry. And this is all over the planet, remember. It's not just one or two cultures that mainstream archaeology and historians call stupid back in the day. I mean, it's basically everybody. Everybody was a caveman while they were building these amazing temples. Okay, you get the point. I keep repeating the same damn thing, but it's just so ridiculously frustrating to hear mainstream historians talk like this. I mean, you just want to... Okay, all right, look. All right, so anyway, we have no choice, but as scientists and critical thinkers, we have no choice but to look at these structures and the components of the structures, the blocks in this case, the megalithic blocks, and come to the conclusion that our ancestors were legitimately operating at a higher level than what they are currently given credit for. All right, okay. So we can scientifically make that claim, regardless of whatever the hell the mainstream continues to support. With all of that said, coming to the conclusion, or the possible conclusion, that our ancestors knew how to make concrete or some sort of geopolymer suddenly becomes a scientific reality. Because if you have the ability to make concrete or cement, and anyway, mix the two up, you then have the ability to mold all kinds of intricate shapes rather easily. This is what we do all the time nowadays, right? So this very simple answer actually starts to make a little sense. Of course, the next question we now have to ask, we can now say, all right, fine, we can go down this path. It's possible that they could have been making some form of geopolymer concrete situation. But how? Like, how did they do this? I mean, mainstream says they are too stupid, so stupid people would not be able to come up with a formula to make a geopolymer. Right, so we get rid of the mainstream because we can look at the structures and we can say, hey, look, it's a legitimate statement to say that a geopolymer may actually have been used here. All right, so that immediately implies that our ancestors had a certain level of intellectual capability. And if you think about it, what was everybody doing back in the day? It's not like everybody back in the day had a 40 to 80 hour, work week. People in general were way more free back in the day than what I think we truly give them credit for. I understand that mainstream history basically paints a picture of all of these empires, emperors, kings, and stuff essentially ruling their areas under an iron fist, and everybody was essentially on lockdown and they were beholden to that king or emperor, right? It's not quite like that. When we go back in time, there was no way that kings, emperors, or whatever, they could not have had that level of control over a large-scale population in the way that we are controlled nowadays, because the tools simply didn't exist. So people out there back in the day, they were able to freely roam, right? They weren't worried about going to a quarry and getting yelled at because they're quarrying stone by some company who sues them, and then they have to go to jail and they get none of that crap really existed. You had access to the planet, basically. I'm not saying you had access to every little spot, and I'm not saying that you couldn't get into trouble maybe with somebody claiming ownership of a certain area, but the reality is you were able to go wherever you wanted to go and grab materials at your leisure, right? You could do that. And so if people had access to doing stuff like that, it only makes sense that people who are intuitive or who have a natural inclination to experimentation would probably go out there, pick up rocks, blend rocks together, try to figure out what's going on, and then over, probably a really short period of time, these people doing basic experimentation with just various minerals and water, and other, interestingly enough, biological substances as well. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But you in a lifetime, in a short span, you could easily see one person, discovering various kinds of geopolymers. This is not out of the realm of a possibility. I mean, people would be experimenting. Obviously, they were experimenting. I mean, look at what humans were doing back in the day. People were moving and shaking. They were doing stuff. So it's not weird to think that somebody could have eventually come up with the geopolymer. It makes sense. It makes logical, scientific, biological sense that a human would stumble upon this fairly early on. I mean, why not? There's literally no reason to bet against it. Let's put it like that. How do you like that? There's more evidence that people back in the day would have figured out something like a geopolymer rather than never have figured out a geopolymer, right? It's way more believable to think that people back in the day would have figured this out. Now, another thing I want to throw out there really quick before we go too deep into this, I am going to essentially continue to use the term geopolymer. The reason why is this, and I'm going to stop using the words cement or concrete. Here's the reason why. Because cement, the way we make cement nowadays, it is one hell of an industrial process. I don't think a lot of people understand how cement is ultimately made. Just go look it up online really quick. There's plenty of walkthroughs. It's crazy. I mean, this is an entire industrial setup with all kinds of technology and machines. And the requirements are crazy. I mean, you need huge furnaces that just burn at ungodly temperatures. Temperatures that the reality is these people would not have been able to replicate even with coal. So the temperatures required to create cement, they get up there. And anyway, you could maybe make an argument that it's possible here and there, but here's the point. The reality is our ancestors did not need to make cement specifically. So while that process may have been able to have been, may have been able to have been whatever. Perhaps somebody actually could go ahead and say, hey, look, actually our ancestors maybe could have pulled off cement. Maybe somebody can actually prove that. I'm not saying that's not provable. That's entirely possible. But we don't need to go that far, interestingly enough. Because when we start to look at the composition of these ancient megalithic blocks, what we start to find is that there is indeed perhaps some kind of an adhesive built into the rock, an unnatural bonding agent. But it's not cement. It's not cement in the sense of how we think about it today. So I just wanted to clear that up really quick so that everybody understands. While I've used the term cement, and you will probably hear other historians, archaeologists, etc., on the alternative side of history mention cement, in a lot of cases, and I would probably argue in most cases, it's not true cement. It's not really like a true concrete in the sense that we have it nowadays. All right, so just throwing that out there. But so what does that leave us with? What exactly is a geopolymer then? So without reading some sort of crazy large word definition, the basic idea of a geopolymer is simple. A geopolymer is a bunch of different kinds of minerals mixed together in a very particular proportion with a reactive agent, that being water, that once you allow it to set, it will set as a harder stone than what you started out with. That's basically what a geopolymer is. I mean, you can literally look at it as just smashing up a bunch of various rocks, throwing it together into a mold, adding water, shaking it up, and then letting it sit and dry. And there, you have a block. I mean, that is the crudest way to kind of explain what a geopolymer is, but that's essentially what it is. There's no magic here. You literally just have to crush up the right minerals, mix them in the correct proportions, add water, and like I said earlier, there's the potential for biological agents being added as well. So for example, I believe the idea is that in Roman concrete, for example, they added blood, and that the iron in the blood somehow helps strengthen the concrete over time. So there is precedence for adding, biological stuff to our concrete, and this is found all over the place actually as well. Anyway, mainly you don't need to go that far. You can literally just crush up different minerals, rocks, throw them together, throw in some water, and then let it set, and then you have a block. I mean, that is not complicated. That is not beyond the intellectual capability of a human, a few thousand years ago, 5,000, 3,000, whatever BC era you want to put this particular situation into. Is that really, does that sound like it's hard to anybody out there? These people had nothing but time to do this kind of stuff if they wanted to. Even more interesting, if they have a king breathing down their neck and they're like, dude, I want this, I want this monument built, bro, and you got to figure it out. And the architect's like, oh man, what the hell do I do? Yeah, right. So hey, let me start mixing some rocks together. You'll try to solve the problem, otherwise you might get executed. So there might actually be a real world reason why you would start hastily trying to invent some form of concrete. Dodging execution, I would say, would be one hell of a motivator to try and figure something out. Now, it also probably didn't even have to go down like that. The reality is, you could very easily picture people back in the day just accidentally coming across findings like this. Now, how do we do that? Well, look what our ancestors were doing. They were well aware that stone was valuable, right? They were working with clays. They were doing all of this stuff just to basically survive day-to-day life. You needed clay jars, for example, to hold stuff. It's very basic stuff. So that means that you're digging in the earth. That means that you are playing with dirt and rocks. Over time, it's incredibly possible that somebody was just messing around with stuff and they mixed a bunch of stuff on accident or whatever. They come back to work the next day to finish up that pot, and he's like, what the hell, where did this giant rock come from, right? I just poured some water that I dropped there yesterday and some other stuff that I threw in there, right? He comes back and suddenly there's a new rock sitting there, right? And then the idea sparks in your head. Oh, ding. Oh, what if I mix a ton of this together and then I can mold it like I mold my clay? And then suddenly we have an industry where we are creating megalithic style blocks in a polygonal style. Like that's entirely possible, right? The fact that nobody wants to admit that it's that simple. I mean, it's that simple. We don't have to do anything crazy. We do not need aliens. We don't need, people carving and chiseling rocks out of a quarry and dragging them around. You don't need any of that. It's even simpler than all of that. Now, I get it. A lot of this people do not want to hear. No, in fact, I would argue that both sides of the research coin are not interested in hearing something as simple as this being the explanation for all of the polygonal blocks and a lot of the other megalithic blocks that we find, right? Because there's no cool mystery here. It's just people existing, stumbling onto a discovery, and then refining and exporting that discovery over time. It's really just that simple. And I get why people don't want to hear that, but hey, here's the reality. What makes more sense? A really simple process that could have very, very easily been discovered within one person's lifetime and developed quite hastily in one person's lifetime. I mean, this is really attractive. This theory of geopolymers really does check off a lot of boxes with respect to trying to figure out the explanation on how these kinds of blocks were created. Okay, so now I've made a case for why it's worth checking this stuff out, but how did they do it? Where did this come from? What evidence do we have that this may be the case? So let's travel right on over to Egypt, since Egypt is going to be one of the more famous areas to where we find these polygonal blocks. And let's see if we can find any potential evidence that would support this claim. Now, the good news about going over to ancient Egypt is that we actually find evidence for geopolymer making all over the place. So let's start with the supposed carved granite blocks that we find all over the place over there in Egypt. So I put a picture up really quick, and this picture is trying to illustrate. I don't know if it's doing a good job, but I'll explain what's going on here. And this stuff is all documented elsewhere in much more depth. You know, maybe if anybody cares, we'll try to link some of this stuff. But anyway, what we have here is we've taken a supposed carved granite block from Egypt. And what we notice when we start looking at these granite blocks is that the outside, it definitely seems like it's granite. All right, so you're like, it looks like granite, it's all good. But if you look at areas that have been massively chipped away, what you find is you can see that there is a definite layer between an outer coating of granite and an inner core made of some kind of sand-based geopolymer. So basically what this is proving visually, you can see it, you can feel it, and it's been tested as well. There's all kinds of scientific experiments that have been done on all of these things, by the way. They're just hard to find because mainstream Egyptology has gone out of its way to either ignore it, outright claim that it's not true, even though the evidence is right there, or they go out of their way to simply attack the researchers who are doing this kind of work. So this is obviously not how science is done. If mainstream is going to make the claim that geopolymers are not being used all over the world, in this case, I'm just kind of talking about Egypt, but if they're going to make that case, then we would expect to find them having some sort of huge scientific explanation that disproves the scientists who are making the discoveries of the geopolymer explanation. You would think that mainstream would have this if they're going to ignore it, if they're going to ignore the evidence that is literally right in front of their face. It's not even hidden. Like, none of this stuff is hidden. You can literally go watch videos of Egypt, anywhere, it doesn't matter, like tourist videos, whatever, and pay attention to when they're filming the stones. You'll see this possible geopolymer situation all over the place. Look at the stones, look at the damaged stones, and you will see the multiple layers. So it becomes a bit ridiculous that the mainstream completely ignores this scientific discovery. All right? Now, I'm not saying it's 100% true, but I gotta be honest. Like I said, I'm gravitating more towards the geopolymers being the case because that's what the evidence is showing. You know, as fun as aliens would have been, you know, we don't need them. And the evidence right in front of us is speaking towards that direction. All right, so mainstream has nothing to say against this at all. There are no scientifically devised experiments that mainstream has executed that would have proven the geopolymer discoveries wrong. All right, so this is a basic fact, so we need to keep this in mind. Mainstream has no answer for this situation. All right, so back to the stone itself. What do we find in this stone? All right, we can prove that there is two layers to some of the megalithic blocks. we can see that there is an outer quote-unquote granite casing, and then if you chip away that granite casing, which has individual levels of thickness, if you can get through that, what you will find in the center is a softer sand limestone-based concretion. Right? So what does this mean? Well, this basically means that the ancient Egyptians, or whoever the hell built all of this stuff back in the day, so basically what we find is a technique that we would use nowadays to essentially cut costs. What the ancient construction people did is that they made a large basic stone out of a cheaper quote-unquote to make concretion. Right? They would just use the limestone sand mixture, and there's a couple other mixtures in there as well, but they make the simpler one for the huge bulk part of the project. Then they made another geopolymer based on granite, and then they took that geogranite polymer and they slathered it on top of the huge core of the cheaper geopolymer. When they were doing this, they would have given the particular block its final shape. And that's what we find in Egypt, right? We find these huge blocks with this particular makeup. And it makes sense. If you're going to build something huge like this and you have access to geopolymers, this is exactly the kind of engineering we would expect. It's smart, it's effective, and it gets the job done in a way that would not take you 8 billion years to do it, and it uses materials wisely. Right? The logistics are important. If a granite geopolymer is more difficult to make than, say, a limestone sand-based polymer, obviously you're going to use the limestone sand-based polymer for all the big garbage crap that doesn't really matter, and then you would save your granite polymer for, whatever you need on the outside, whatever you need to look good, whatever you're trying to truly protect, that's what you would cover in your granite polymer. And that's exactly what we find. I mean, these Egyptians are doing, they're doing exactly what we would expect a construction company to do if it's trying to be thrifty, if it's trying to be effective, and it's trying to use its resources correctly. Right? And so here it is. Right? We can't get away from what we are physically seeing. Now, the next question that we need to ask is, all right, if they're geopolymers, I mean, we can possibly see that. This is a path worth following. What were they made out of? Sounds pretty basic. This is a really good question. What were all of these geopolymers made from? I mean, certainly geologists could take a sample and we could, crush it down, do what we need to do with it, and we should be able to prove or disprove the geopolymer situation. And this has been done. A group of scientists got a hold of some of the stuff from Egypt, and it's funny. It looks like this started taking place back in the 80s, 90s, etc., and it's gone from there. It's harder to get samples nowadays, but anyway, these guys were able to get a lot of the samples back in the day before Egypt got as locked down as it is now. Anyway, so they took all the samples and they threw them under electron microscopes, and they started to discover stuff. So what they started to find is that when they started looking at the granite portion of these blocks, they immediately noticed that the structure of the quote-unquote granite had nothing to do with naturally formed granite. I mean, nothing. And I'm showing a picture of it right now. What they found was they didn't find the feldspars in the correct orientations. They didn't find the gaps between the minerals the way that you find those gaps in minerals in granite. Instead, they found this weird, jumbled up conglomeration of minerals, and they found that the grain itself had nothing to do with naturally formed granite, even though this is technically classified as granite. So basically what they were finding, I'm not going to go into all the crazy science. There's stuff out there, and maybe we'll do that on a different episode. I'm just evaluating possibilities here of how the stones were created. I know, I can't anyway. But this is what they found, and this is the science. I mean, what do you want from me? If the science points toward artificially created granite, right, I have no choice but to agree with it. You can see the pictures. You can see the evidence. You can even test. Technically, anybody could actually test this evidence if you can get a hold of some of those samples. The fact that you might not be able to get samples anymore from Egypt is very telling. What that means is that the mainstream is not interested at all in any kind of scientific explanation when it comes to how the blocks were made. So anyway, what we have here is we have scientific proof that is showing that the granite coatings, and these are objective coatings, right? This is not fake. These are granite coatings that coat a different kind of inner stone, and that's a different kind of geopolymer. This granite is artificial. All right, the evidence is there. All right, really quick as a side note, does that mean every single granite formation is artificial in the sense of they are all geopolymers? No, not at all. And I need to make sure that everybody understands that we still do have plenty of evidence that somehow at some point in time people were able to carve out huge blocks of granite straight from the bedrock. All right, that stuff is there, and I completely acknowledge that. But the findings here stand. If people didn't have to carve huge granite blocks out of the earth, if they were just able to say, hey, we can just use our geopolymers to form what we need and then strengthen it, obviously you're going to go that route. Both can be true. I guess that's my main point. Both directions can be simultaneously true. Now, of course, when they were looking and testing at all of these geopolymer or potential geopolymer stones, they also did indeed discover the makeup of these stones. And I'm not going to go into details about the recipes and everything, or at least, well, not yet. We have some other stuff we need to talk about. But the geologists who ran these tests, they came out with all the ratios of what created some of these geopolymers. Even more interesting is some of the stuff that they tested, they actually found out that some of the blocks that were made using some of the geopolymers were not as strong as they were probably originally meant to be. So basically what happened was we found proof that our ancestors would sometimes cut corners and use inferior ingredients in some of their creations, right? This really adds a very human element to all of these ancient stone structures, because we find mistakes with all of this. You would think that if some crazy alien master race came down and decided to build all of these things, you would think they would have some decent precision, and you would think they would have the knowledge to make a higher quality, longer lasting stone. We don't find that. We actually find the opposite. We find good quality stone, good quality, craftsmanship, but we also find shoddy craftsmanship. We find both of these things, especially on the Giza Plateau. Now that, just throwing it out there, that's just another observational piece of evidence that does indeed point in the direction of our ancestors, using basic human technology to create some amazing things. All right. Okay, so geologists have indeed figured out the ratios more or less for some of the geopolymers. Like I said, they can't test everything because it's almost impossible now to get a sample out of Egypt, right? And even if you smuggled one out, you probably can't publicize your findings because, then governments will come down on you and you'll have to deal with all that garbage. So it sucks. Basically, we are essentially in a position to where we have the mainstream saying how much they love science, but then at the same time, they don't want any science being done on any of the established chronologies. What are we even supposed to do in this position, right? Anyway. Okay, so we've established that there is a scientific basis that can technically prove that the observational findings that we have discovered may actually be geopolymers. All right, but can we go further, right? Yeah, we can, and we will go further. All right, so check this out. The next thing you have to ask yourself is like, okay, fine, they can mix some dirt together, various rocks, whatever. That makes sense. It's doable. Fine, we get that. But do we have any more evidence that would substantiate the claim that the Egyptians actually made these blocks? I mean, are there any records of this? Is there any kind of a historical precedence that may help back up this particular style of construction? And that would make sense. That's a legitimate question, right? Because if geopolymers were used on the mass level that right now we are starting to think they were used on, you would think there would be some sort of, record or something maybe that just at least, maybe Bob the Builder over there just wrote in his diary, "Today I spilled a bunch of geopolymer onto Zach's head and we all had a good laugh." You would expect to find maybe something written about this. You would expect to maybe find a hieroglyph or two that would maybe corroborate the concept of geopolymer making. right? Because it would have been one hell of an industry. If we look around at a lot of these sites in existence in ancient times, not just at Egypt, the projects are huge. I mean, these are not little projects where two dudes were hanging around and just kind of doing it as a side job, right? While they went to work in the day and they worked on a pyramid at night. Now, right, this was an entire industry that existed back in the day. So you would expect to find maybe some kind of a record recording it. Yeah, record recording it. It's redundant. Okay. Do we find something like that? Here's a few things that I found were very interesting. So I want to show this hieroglyph right now on the screen. If you're just listening to this, basically what we see is a bunch of your standard Egyptian workers, but it looks like they're going through a process where they are taking the material, they are melding it together to create, the mash of the concrete or the geopolymer. Then they transport that, lump of geopolymer over to an area to where it is then formed, and then they load it up and they start doing something else with it. So we do have some kind of a quote-unquote SOP for how you would do the entire construction process. In this hieroglyph right here, we see guys bending over, we see them mining rocks, we see them putting them into buckets, then we see them going over and dumping them into things and then forming a mash of something. Then that pile of something, which we are assuming is geopolymers, then gets shaped into a block. I mean, it looks like a block to me. And then the block goes down the assembly line and it continues on until it's placed into the structure itself. Now, is that exactly what's being shown here? Can we argue that something else is going on here? Yes, we can. I cannot say 100% with any kind of certainty that this particular hieroglyph, and there's a couple others like this, by the way. I'm just too lazy to go dig them up. But are hieroglyphics like this truly showing the real process on how things like, the pyramid blocks may have been made? Or really, any block that we find on the Giza Plateau? Is this truly showing that? I can't say with certainty. I really can't. But, hey, it is interesting that it exists, though. And it does seem to follow kind of what we would expect, or it follows the process that we would maybe expect to find if we were dealing with a people that were messing around with geopolymers. It does seem like a logistical supply line of starting with dirt, moving all the way up to blocks. I don't know. Okay, so it's possible, but this is not a solid piece of information. But stuff like this does exist, right? The question was, do we have any records potentially that would explain the process that would prove that perhaps the geopolymers were legitimately created by the people back then? Here you go. All right, but can we take this further? What other proofs do we maybe have that were recorded? Here is where it gets really interesting. Back in 1891, a discovery was made. A stone stele on the island of Sahel, which is near Elephantine, which is also north of Aswan. I don't know, did I say that right? Elephantine? I don't know. Elephantine. Anyway, the island of Sahel. They found a stone stele, which was engraved on a rock, and this stele had a bunch of columns of hieroglyphics written on them. This stele eventually got the name of the Famine Stele. All right, I hope I'm saying that right. I think that's what it's supposed to be about. Anyway, so what happened is they found this stele and it had all these columns and rows of hieroglyphics on it. When they started to translate the hieroglyphics on the stone, what they interestingly enough found was that this stone seems to be talking about all of the ingredients necessary to create the kind of geopolymers that were used all over Egypt. So, and this is actually basically accepted by the mainstream, by the way. This is not like a crackpot situation. If you go look up the Famine Stele, you'll see what I'm talking about. Anyways, this stele appears to contain all the ingredients needed to create a geopolymer. All right, and there's kind of a story that goes on in the stele as well, right? There's like a god that teaches Zoser about all of this stuff. The stele is supposed to be talking about Zoser, who is supposedly supposed to be the beginning of the pyramid situation and all of that. Anyway, so this stele talks about that. The interesting thing about this stele is, not only does it appear to give us the minerals that you are supposed to mix together to create the various geopolymers, it also, for some weird reason, talks about odors. Yeah, odors, smells. Isn't that you? What? Okay, what the hell are you talking about? Why are we talking about smells? We just went from geopolymer. Now things stink. What's going on? This is what's interesting. They start talking about smells. Why would they talk about smells in a production process? Right? And most people you probably just thought about it. The reality is, in modern production processes, we use chemicals all the time, don't we? Right? Chemicals are an unfortunate staple of all kinds of production processes. To make all kinds of materials, we generally use and need chemicals to either break down materials or build up materials, depending on whatever the hell it is we're building. Is this stele also referencing the chemicals needed to create the blocks that we find around Giza? This is interesting because it kind of makes sense. I mean, is it possible that our ancestors were not only able to smash rocks together, throw water in, and create a block, but were they actually dealing with some kind of a chemical combination that would aid in the construction of the blocks themselves? And that's a very real possibility, right? It's an amazing possibility, but and most people, in fact, I don't really hear anybody ever talk about people using chemicals in relation to the construction of these, megaliths, mega monuments, stone monuments, whatever. But it would perhaps make sense if our ancestors can do all this other crazy stuff. I mean, is it so hard to believe that they had mastered control over certain chemical processes? I mean, they obviously would have had to master control of it because, dealing with minerals and stuff like that is a level of chemistry, right? Geochemistry. But anyway, did they have knowledge of other kinds of chemicals and how to create other kinds of chemicals and then employ those chemicals in the construction, of the blocks? And I think there's a very real possibility that our ancestors would have had that capability. I don't think that's in the realm of science fiction. And so to find a stele that is talking about this stuff, that's fascinating. And we can't ignore it. I mean, there it is. It's right there. There's our scientific proof. Now, with respect to the stele, it is interesting that a god is given credit to bringing the information down to Imhotep in this case. But the credit for the knowledge does not come through some kind of a intellectual evolution. Apparently, it comes from a god, right? So who is this god that shows up and basically gives the Egyptians this geopolymer capability? Right? I don't have an answer for it, but it is interesting that we don't find a gradual discovery of this stuff. According to this stele anyways, but the stele makes it clear that this stuff was brought to humans from a god. So just something interesting, I'm just saying, we have to look at it from all angles, and this is on the stele. Now, if right now you just lit up and you're like, holy crap, give me these combinations, tell me these minerals, and I want to go test it, right? Because that was my first thought as well. There's a problem with that, however. So the problem comes with respect to the translation. So right now, there's about 5 or 6, or maybe even more. There's a certain number of these hieroglyphs that they know represent some kind of a mineral. They just don't know which hieroglyphic is related to a specific mineral. Yeah, this sucks, but this is where we are stuck at right now. Now, that does not mean that in the future, somebody won't be able to translate these hieroglyphs and get the correct minerals. Once that happens, once we know what those particular hieroglyphics mean, then we can start trying those combinations and we can go from there. But for now, we can't test what is technically on this stela at the moment. Yeah, I know it sucks, but hey, it is what it is. But it's very interesting that it's talked about at all right? So that's a legitimate piece of evidence. Okay, so let's keep going. I know this is getting longer, but we're almost to the end. So what other kinds of evidence should we find if we are going to say that the Egyptians, or anybody really, used geopolymers in the manufacture of all of these ruins? Well, I guess it would have been buildings for them, ruins for us. But what other evidence is there? I mean, in my opinion, so far, up to this point, we've actually shown quite a lot of evidence to where you at least should have to take this concept seriously. And this is why I take it seriously now. I didn't take it seriously because this is some pet, schizo thing that I decided on. No, the more I look at the evidence for the geopolymer situation, the less holes I'm able to poke in it. And the more it starts to explain all of our observational data. So that's good science right there. But is there any other evidence that we have? And yeah, there is. There's even more evidence. All right, so check this out. So after they would have made the geopolymer, they would have had to have formed it, right? They would have had to have probably used some kind of a molding situation to get the geopolymer into the shape that they wanted it. All right, makes sense, obvious, whatever. Okay, and there are multiple methods for forming concrete or geopolymer, right? You can just make nice little wood molds and stuff like that, pour it in there, knock the wood out, then you have a right angle stone, right? You can have whatever shape you want, really, as long as you could just create the mold. So here's another important aspect of using geopolymers, and that's the molding process. Right, so if they were molding all these crazy bricks and blocks and all this stuff, throwing them everywhere, I mean, shouldn't we maybe find some of the remnants of the molds? And sure enough, we actually probably do have some of those remnants. But here's the problem with the molds. Like I said, the molds were more than likely made out of wood, generally speaking. And this was a while ago. Well, sort of a while ago. Actually, we'll talk about when this might have taken place in chronology in a second. But anyway, we should find evidence of molds to some degree or another. Wood is a material that is very commonly used in molding. But wood is degradable, right? So let's just, so if we were to go off of mainstream chronology, right? 5,000 years ago or whatever they say, that all of this stuff was built and done. Is wood going to survive 5,000 years in the desert when you have not only just the environmental conditions to deal with, but also the human population that would be running into these wooden molds, right? Would the wooden molds have survived those 5,000 years? And the answer is generally probably not, and for a couple of reasons. The first reason, like I said, environmental. The environment over there in Egypt is harsh. And also, to be fair, in other parts of the world where wooden molds may have been used, a lot of these environments were probably also different during the time. Anyway, wood would have to survive in their environments, basically somehow untouched. And that's not happening, right? Second law of thermodynamics is going to show up. It's going to chew through the wood over the years, and eventually the wood is going to go bye-bye simply by natural causes. Right, so that's one point against being able to find any of these wooden molds. Another problem is that these wooden molds, if they're laying around doing nothing, do you honestly believe that the people would have just, let these things stack up and not do anything with them when they were done? And of course, the answer is more than likely no. The people around here would have repurposed these objects, right? They would have used the wood for other building structures. They may have ripped them up and used them for other molds, and then they could have broken down there. They could have been used everything from, just, hey, we have scrap wood, let's light a fire, all the way to, hey, we need wood in some completely other area in the country, let's ship it over there. And then the point is that there are a lot of things that could have easily destroyed a lot of the molds that we would hope to find. Now, that does not mean we have not found wooden molds. There have been plenty of discoveries all over this planet of wooden artifacts that could have been the actual molds, but are being mislabeled by historians and archaeologists, right? That's a very real possibility. And the fact that we cannot get our hands on any of these artifacts to test them, that speaks volumes, right? If we cannot perform real scientific tests on these discoveries, something's up, right? Somebody is hiding something. Anyway, so if you're wondering where the hell are all of these wooden molds, I would expect to not find very many laying around given the amount of time that has passed. And I mean that even in real chronology as well. If you stick with mainstream chronology, you have like 5,000 years between them and us right now to where we would have found these molds. Plenty of time for stuff to vaporize, disappear, be used, stolen, whatever. Plenty of time. And of course it's happened, right? There's no question about that. But if you factor in even the new chronology, there's still at least probably 1,000-ish years or so that these wooden artifacts would have been dealt with by nature and or humans. So there's a lot of time in there, and I don't think people truly appreciate how much damage time has done to so many pieces of evidence all over the planet, right? You get it, okay. Anyway, so, but is there any other evidence of molding? And sure enough, yes, there is. There's 2 other pieces of evidence that I want to discuss, and then you can go back to living your life. The first piece of evidence is this. We have actually found embedded in quote-unquote carved rocks or carved blocks, we have literally found embedded woven grass that lines these blocks. What that means is that the Egyptians were using the embedded grass kind of like we would have used rebar to strengthen certain blocks. And these discoveries have been made. So right now on the screen, what I am showing is the discovery that was made in Egypt, where we plainly and clearly find woven grass embedded into carved stone, right? Nobody's embedding woven grass into carved stone, right? This is more than likely a geopolymer. And what we're seeing here is the structural reinforcement of said geopolymer. All right, so that's another interesting piece of evidence. How the hell does grass get embedded randomly into stone? All right, so the next thing we can look at really fast that might prove the geopolymer situation is that when you start to look at a lot of the bricks, especially around Egypt, or not bricks, the larger stones, for example, the stones on the pyramids, what's interesting is that on the lower half of the pyramid, the stones are all relatively formless, right? They're nice little blocks of sort, but there's no, they just kind of still have a very stone look to them. However, when you go up higher and you get out of the way of the natural erosion from the desert, you find blocks that look like this. What we see here is we see a part of a block from the Great Pyramid, and you see it has all these vertical and horizontal striations. Where did these vertical and horizontal striations come from? Why does this exist on the surface of the block? Now, some people might say that these are tool marks. Okay, fine. But could it be something else? And the answer is yeah, it probably is something else. And that something else is this. It may be the leftover imprint from the grass used in the molding process. And here you can see the imprints on the outside of the block, just like we find in the ancient Egyptian stonework. So once again, here's more scientific, hard, objective evidence that is pulling towards geopolymers being heavily used in the past. You know, what can we do with this evidence? I mean, it's right here. We have to admit that it exists. I mean, we can't just ignore this. And this is what Egyptologists are doing. They are completely ignoring this stuff. I mean, how do you get around this? Well, and that's why they ignore it, right? Because they can't get around it. In fact, I have not seen anybody actually get around this at all. And now, once again, I'm not even a cheerleader for this theory, but the more I look into it and the more science I find behind it, you know, there's a really compelling case that this is how, or something like this, is generally how a lot of our ancestors accomplished what they did. All right, here, let's show one more piece of evidence really fast, and then we'll call this garbage. The last piece of evidence I want to show is when they were looking through the microscope and they were looking at this geopolymer, this possible geopolymer situation, what they found embedded inside the stone, right? They had to dig into it to get it, is they actually found embedded fibers in the stone, organic fibers. By that I mean like sheep fibers or something like that. Hair. They found hair embedded in the stone. Why would we find hair embedded in a naturally created stone? Right? You wouldn't. There's no reason to find hair in a stone that was formed by the earth. That would never happen. There's no geological explanation that could account why you would find tons of hair fibers within the stone itself. What this proves is that the Egyptians, or whoever was building at the time, they were trying to reinforce the blocks with other means as well besides just grass. They were incorporating all these hair or fiber follicles. This would have allowed the geopolymer to latch onto something, and in theory, it would have strengthened the block itself. Right? So it's just more evidence, right? Look at all of this. It's okay. All right. So that's all I have to say for the geopolymer side of things. There's a lot more to talk about, and obviously I didn't go into all of the details, but just this method alone has so many pieces of evidence for it. It's mind-blowing that everybody ignores it. Even alternative researchers don't jump on this like they really should. I mean, here's the science. I implore you to go dig around more in this area, because this is it's an amazing area, and it really does have the potential to begin to explain all kinds of stuff within our past. All right, let me leave you with one other thing, actually. I know I said I was going to let you go, but hold on. One other thing. Let's talk about chronology really quick. So right now, mainstream, I'll just focus on Egypt. We'll just stick to one topic. Otherwise, this show is going to go on for 10 more hours. In Egypt, right now, mainstream wants to say that a lot of this megalithic work was done 5,000 years ago. We'll just say that as a nice round number. And of course, there's various dates, but they push this pretty far back. Alternative researchers right now, it's kind of a fad to push back the pyramids and these works even further. Right? We have a very popular group right now that is trying to make a claim that perhaps the Sphinx and the pyramids are 10,000 years old. Right? And that would be because of the geology. We all know the geology situation over there with the Sphinx, and that's where this claim comes from. Right? I'm no longer convinced that we should be shifting our history backwards anymore. Real chronology, the new chronology, is really starting to show us that things may have happened a lot earlier than we originally thought. This situation with the blocks, with the megalithic construction, may not have happened 5,000 years ago, and it may not have been a 10,000 year ago situation either. New evidence, or I should say old evidence, being looked at finally again, is actually starting to show us that perhaps all of this stuff, all of this dynastic stuff that we attribute to all the dynastic Egyptians, did not happen 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. It may have only happened 1,000 to 1,200 years ago. The reason why I bring this up at all is because one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we are looking at things like the geopolymer blocks is we actually have to ask the question, how long do these blocks truly last? I mean, could they really stand up for 10,000 years essentially untouched? Is that truly what could have happened? Could 10,000-year-old blocks have not been worn down by the sand over that course of period of time? I mean, you would think that sharp edges would almost be non-existent in Egypt due to that fact alone, just the basic sand erosion. But we find sharp edges all over the place. Do sharp edges potentially prove that these blocks were not made 10,000 years ago, that they were made only 1,000-ish years ago? If that's the case, that would actually explain why our ancestors maybe were doing a little better than we think they would have been doing, because they come closer to us now, relatively speaking, in chronology. And there has not been enough time for natural causes to erode the crap out of these things. I mean, if you go and look at a lot of these Egyptian blocks nowadays, especially the ones that we're considering geopolymer in origin, a lot of this stuff is actually flaking apart. Some of it's still strong, especially some of the granite mixtures, but there's a lot of stuff where you go over there and this stuff, you can just dig into it. And there are people that have done this. You can go see that. You can watch people do it. It's not me making this up. It's not a theory. You can literally dig into Egyptian blocks right now. So it begs the question, how old really is this technology, right? Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. We've talked long enough. But hopefully now at this point, you are at least willing to take the concept of geopolymers at least a little seriously. And then hopefully we can get mainstream to one day sort of open their eyes so that we can start to get a hold of some of these artifacts or some of these stones so that we can actually start doing some real scientific tests on these things. Because without that, I mean, so long as mainstream Egyptology continues to deny any scientific methodology applied to testing what they claim, right, we can't believe anything they say. And that's just the case. All right. Okay, we're done. I'm done talking about this crap. Go back to life. Enjoy your day.